That is, the interpretive context that shapes how an interaction is perceived and responded to. Narcissists are highly adept at manipulating this frame. They construct social dynamics where they occupy the position of superiority, whether that's moral, intellectual, or emotional. This positioning enables them to dictate the rules of engagement, how conversations unfold, whose feelings are prioritized, and what narratives are allowed to persist. When you challenge this frame, subtly but intentionally, you undermine their psychological leverage. It's important to understand that this does not require confrontation or aggression. In fact, the most effective frame control is executed with composure and strategic questioning. For example, when a narcissist initiates a guilt-based dialogue portraying themselves as the victim while casting you in a position of blame, they are attempting to define your role within a narrative they control. Responding with measured, open-ended questions such as, "What leads you to believe that's my responsibility?" or "Can you help me understand what made you feel that way?" introduces a reflective element that shifts the focus away from emotion-driven manipulation toward rational inquiry. From a neurobiological perspective, this is significant. The act of reframing a situation recruits the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, perspective taking, and cognitive flexibility. Narcissistic individuals often operate from a place of emotional immediacy, favoring limbic system activation, particularly in areas associated with ego defense and emotional reactivity. When you introduce a rational frame, you force engagement with neural circuits that are less comfortable for them. You're shifting the terrain of the interaction from emotional reflex to cognitive deliberation. There is also utility in what behavioral science refers to as a pattern interrupt. If the narcissist begins deploying a well-rehearsed behavioral sequence, such as self-glorification or covert criticism, disrupt the rhythm with an unexpected yet grounded response. This could take the form of a philosophical observation or an empirical question that they are unprepared to address. The goal is not to derail the conversation, but to reassert cognitive authorship over the direction it takes. Equally important is the nonverbal dimension of frame control. Calm posture, regulated breathing, and direct but relaxed eye contact signal a nervous system that is not dysregulated by their tactics. This sends a clear cue that their attempts at control are ineffective and, more importantly, unnecessary. You're not just resisting their frame, you're redefining the structure of the interaction entirely. One of the most neurologically strategic approaches to neutralizing narcissistic behavior is the intentional use of delayed responses. Narcissistic individuals rely heavily on immediacy in social interaction. Their sense of control and validation is reinforced when others respond quickly, whether with praise, defense, or emotional engagement. This need for rapid feedback is not simply a behavioral preference. It reflects an underlying dependency on predictable emotional stimulation. By altering the timing of your responses, whether in conversation, digital communication, or decision-making, you interrupt this reward loop and introduce cognitive uncertainty, which has measurable effects on their emotional regulation. From a behavioral neuroscience perspective, this intervention engages the concept of prediction error, which is central to dopaminergic signaling in the brain. Narcissists, like all individuals, develop internal models that predict how others will react to them. These models are especially rigid in individuals with narcissistic traits, as their ego stability depends on being able to provoke and control the responses of those around them. When you delay your reaction, you introduce a mismatch between expectation and outcome. This prediction error triggers an adaptive stress response, which, rather than reinforcing their behavior, creates emotional disequilibrium. Over time, the repeated experience of delayed feedback undermines the reliability of their manipulative strategies. The impact of this is twofold. First, it destabilizes their control by removing the immediacy they rely on to maintain dominance. Second, it shifts the dynamic in your favor by allowing your prefrontal cortex, the region associated with executive function, emotional regulation, and decision-making, to remain in control of the interaction. Delayed response acts as a cognitive buffer, granting you space to process, evaluate, and respond with intention rather than compulsion. This is especially critical in emotionally charged scenarios, where impulsive reactions often serve to reinforce the narcissist's position of psychological authority. This tactic does not require emotional detachment, but rather emotional discipline. The delay may be as brief as a few seconds of silence in a conversation, or as extended as hours before responding to a message or request. What matters is the consistent demonstration that your emotional and behavioral responses are not reactive but self-governed. The moment you control the timing, you begin to control the psychological rhythm of the exchange. This places the narcissist in a reactive position, often unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable for them, where their usual strategies become less effective and increasingly transparent. One of the most neurologically grounded and behaviorally effective strategies for interrupting narcissistic influence is the intentional withdrawal of psychological rewards. Narcissistic individuals rely heavily on external validation to regulate their self-esteem and reinforce a grandiose self-concept. This validation can take many forms: verbal admiration, emotional engagement, compliance, or even conflict, and functions as a form of reinforcement that sustains their behavioral patterns. The concept aligns with well-established principles in operant conditioning. Behaviors that are rewarded tend to be repeated. By strategically withholding those rewards, particularly when they are anticipated, you interrupt this reinforcement cycle at the neurological and behavioral level. The brain's reward system, primarily the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, including structures like the ventral striatum, is central to how individuals process social feedback. Narcissists often have heightened sensitivity to social rewards, especially those that affirm their self-importance. Their behavioral patterns are shaped by years of extracting predictable responses from others. When you cease providing those responses, whether by withholding praise, disengaging from argumentative traps, or declining to rescue them from emotional self-sabotage, you disrupt a deeply conditioned stimulus-response loop. The absence of expected feedback generates a prediction error, which leads to emotional discomfort and cognitive dissonance. Importantly, this technique is not about emotional withdrawal or passive-aggressive silence. It is an active and conscious decision to disengage from dynamics that serve only to reinforce their control. For example, when a narcissistic individual attempts to provoke anger to reaffirm their sense of power, and you instead remain composed and non-reactive, they are denied the emotional currency they expected. Over time, and with consistent application, this leads to extinction, a well-documented process in behavioral science where unrewarded behaviors diminish in frequency and intensity. From a neurocognitive standpoint, you are training their brain to associate your presence with unpredictability, not reinforcement. This unpredictability weakens the neural pathways that previously associated your interaction with reward, leading to a destabilization of the psychological mechanisms they use to maintain dominance. Simultaneously, this practice reinforces your own executive control systems, particularly the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to stay regulated and intentional in your responses. The professional utility of reward withdrawal lies in its subtlety. It does not escalate conflict nor require overt confrontation, yet it fundamentally alters the architecture of the interaction. By selectively removing validation and emotional availability, you create a psychological environment in which the narcissist can no longer extract the reinforcement they seek, which over time forces an adaptive or avoidant response. One of the most neurologically grounded and behaviorally effective strategies for interrupting narcissistic influence is the intentional withdrawal of psychological rewards. Narcissistic individuals rely heavily on external validation to regulate their self-esteem and reinforce a grandiose self-concept. This validation can take many forms: verbal admiration, emotional engagement, compliance, or even conflict, and functions as a form of reinforcement that sustains their behavioral patterns. The concept aligns with well-established principles in operant conditioning. Behaviors that are rewarded tend to be repeated. By strategically withholding those rewards, particularly when they are anticipated, you interrupt this reinforcement cycle at the neurological and behavioral level. The brain's reward system, primarily the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, including structures like the ventral striatum, is central to how individuals process social feedback. Narcissists often have heightened sensitivity to social rewards, especially those that affirm their self-importance. Their behavioral patterns are shaped by years of extracting predictable responses from others. When you cease providing those responses, whether by withholding praise, disengaging from argumentative traps, or declining to rescue them from emotional self-sabotage, you disrupt a deeply conditioned stimulus-response loop. The absence of expected feedback generates a prediction error, which leads to emotional discomfort and cognitive dissonance. Importantly, this technique is not about emotional withdrawal or passive-aggressive silence. It is an active and conscious decision to disengage from dynamics that serve only to reinforce their control. For example, when a narcissistic individual attempts to provoke anger to reaffirm their sense of power, and you instead remain composed and non-reactive, they are denied the emotional currency they expected. Over time, and with consistent application, this leads to extinction, a well-documented process in behavioral science where unrewarded behaviors diminish in frequency and intensity. From a neurocognitive standpoint, you are training their brain to associate your presence with unpredictability, not reinforcement. This unpredictability weakens the neural pathways that previously associated your interaction with reward, leading to a destabilization of the psychological mechanisms they use to maintain dominance. Simultaneously, this practice reinforces your own executive control systems, particularly the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to stay regulated and intentional in your responses. The professional utility of reward withdrawal lies in its subtlety. It does not escalate conflict nor require overt confrontation, yet it fundamentally alters the architecture of the interaction. By selectively removing validation and emotional availability, you create a psychological environment in which the narcissist can no longer extract the reinforcement they seek, which over time forces an adaptive or avoidant response. You said, Keynote 4 expanded up to minimum 400 words, and do not add any ending sentence, do not add bullets, points, and mention. Every keynote heading, ChatGPT said. Mirror and expose a nuanced and highly effective psychological strategy for dismantling narcissistic control is the deliberate act of mirroring and exposing their behavior. Narcissists rely on asymmetry in relationships. They expect others to follow while they lead, to absorb emotional cues while they project, and to remain responsive while they remain unpredictable. This imbalance is what enables their manipulative tactics to thrive. By carefully reflecting their own patterns back to them, either through verbal engagement or behavioral mimicry, you interrupt that asymmetry and initiate a form of cognitive confrontation. This forces them to confront a version of themselves they work hard to conceal or rationalize. The practice of mirroring, when used in this context, is not about passive repetition, but about controlled reflection. For instance, if a narcissist frequently uses sarcasm or passive-aggressive language to exert dominance, reflecting that same tone back to them in a neutral, unemotional manner can expose the structure of their communication. When they hear their own strategies mirrored without emotional reactivity, It disrupts the flow of manipulation and creates a subtle but sharp awareness that their tactics are being observed and decoded. This exposure, even if indirect, registers as a threat to their constructed self-image, which depends heavily on being seen as clever, in control, or untouchable. From a neurological standpoint, mirroring activates the mirror neuron system, primarily located in the promoter cortex and inferior parietal lobule. This system is involved in both understanding others' actions and experiencing social empathy. When their own behaviors are mirrored, narcissists unconsciously process those actions as if they themselves had produced them. For individuals with narcissistic traits, this can induce discomfort because the cognitive dissonance between their idealized self-image and the reflected reality becomes difficult to ignore. It introduces an implicit feedback loop that they cannot easily escape, particularly if it's delivered without overt confrontation. Verbal exposure also plays a critical role in this process. When you articulate their behavior patterns using clear, observational language, such as pointing out repeated contradictions or drawing attention to shifting narratives, you apply a rational framework to behavior that is often designed to operate below conscious scrutiny. This form of exposure engages the prefrontal cortex, requiring them to either rationalize or retreat. It denies them the ambiguity they often use to manipulate emotional boundaries. The goal is not to shame or humiliate, but to destabilize the automatic nature of their behavior by making it observable, nameable, and therefore subject to accountability. In professional or personal contexts, this technique must be applied with precision and restraint. Overexposure or emotionally charged reflection can trigger defensive escalation. However, when executed calmly and with minimal emotional investment, the act of mirroring and exposing functions as a psychological disruptor, circuiting the narcissist's established behavioral scripts and undermining their perceived control over the interaction. You said, Keynote 4, make this more provisional speech chat, GPT said. Mirror and expose, a strategically refined method for disrupting narcissistic dominance, is the practice of mirroring and exposing their behavioral patterns. Narcissistic individuals often depend on relational asymmetry, maintaining control by projecting emotional cues while expecting others to absorb them without resistance. Their interpersonal strategies are built on implicit psychological contracts. They initiate, others respond. They critique, others self-correct. This imbalance sustains their perceived superiority. By mirroring their behaviors and exposing their tactics in a measured and emotionally neutral manner, you introduce an element of cognitive confrontation that challenges the psychological infrastructure they rely upon to maintain control. Mirroring in this context refers to the intentional reflection of their behavioral style, whether that be tone, logic structure, or communication rhythm. It is not about mimicry for the sake of imitation, but rather the deployment of their own tactics in a calibrated form to reveal underlying patterns. For example, if a narcissistic individual frequently employs passive-aggressive remarks, responding with similarly structured language, absent emotional charge, can force a self-reflective moment. The behavior they typically externalize onto others is returned to them within a controlled and predictable format. This often triggers discomfort as it exposes a behavioral mechanism they are accustomed to deploying without consequence. The neurobiological basis of this strategy lies in the mirror neuron system, located primarily in the promoter cortex and inferior parietal lobule. These neurons facilitate social learning and empathetic recognition by allowing individuals to internalize the actions and emotional states of others. When narcissists are confronted with their own behavior, either through behavioral mirroring or structured verbal feedback, this neural circuitry is activated, often producing a momentary break in their cognitive defense mechanisms. Because narcissistic personalities are highly invested in maintaining a polished external persona, This form of implicit reflection challenges the congruence between their self-perception and observable behavior, exposing their patterns explicitly through precise observational language amplifies this effect. Statements such as, "You've shifted your stance on this 3 times in the last 5 minutes," or "You tend to ask questions that are actually veiled criticisms," introduce structure and logic to an otherwise emotionally ambiguous interaction. This forces engagement with the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive functioning and self-monitoring. In doing so, you transition the conversation from an emotionally manipulative environment into a cognitively regulated space. Narcissists often resist this transition as it neutralizes their ability to dominate through ambiguity and emotional control. It is essential, however, that this approach be delivered with clinical neutrality. Any indication of emotional investment can invite escalation or deflection. When executed with restraint and clarity, mirroring and exposure interrupt the automaticity of narcissistic behavior and invite a degree of self-awareness they are often unaccustomed to confronting. A central dynamic underpinning narcissistic behavior is the unrelenting drive to command and maintain psychological centrality in any interaction. Whether through overt self-aggrandizement or covert emotional manipulation, narcissists orchestrate environments that direct attention, validation, and emotional energy toward themselves. This central positioning is not incidental. It is a core mechanism of control that reinforces their sense of superiority, relevance, and dominance. The deliberate act of shifting the focus directing cognitive and emotional attention away from the narcissist, serves as a subtle yet neurologically effective method for destabilizing this dynamic. At the behavioral level, this technique involves interrupting their monopolization of conversational bandwidth. When a narcissistic individual seeks to dominate an interaction through storytelling, victim narratives, or unsolicited critique, responding with redirection disrupts the expected pattern. This could mean introducing a neutral topic, shifting attention to another participant in a group setting, or reframing the conversation toward shared outcomes rather than individual experiences. The key is not confrontation, but recalibration, steering the dialogue in a direction that does not reinforce their psychological centrality. In effect, you are restructuring the attention economy of the interaction. From a neurobiological standpoint, this strategy engages and strengthens the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex DLPFC, the region responsible for attentional control, cognitive flexibility, and executive decision-making. By consciously choosing where to direct your attention, you override the default emotional reactivity often triggered in narcissistic interactions. At the same time, the narcissist experiences a reduction in reward signaling through dopaminergic pathways, particularly within the ventral tegmental area VTA and the nucleus accumbens. These structures are central to the brain's motivation and reinforcement systems. In individuals with narcissistic traits, these systems become especially active when they are the focal point of social or emotional validation. Shifting attention away interrupts this neurochemical feedback loop and weakens the behavioral incentive structure they rely upon. This tactic is particularly potent in group or professional contexts. When you elevate the contributions of others, validate diverse perspectives, or re-anchor the discussion toward collective goals, you communicate, implicitly and without confrontation, that no single individual is entitled to dominate the psychological space. This creates a more distributed attention dynamic, which diminishes the narcissist's ability to extract disproportionate influence from the interaction. The discomfort this generates often reveals itself through attempts to reclaim focus, but consistency in redirection gradually erodes the expectation that they will be catered to. Importantly, shifting the focus is not merely a form of interpersonal boundary setting, it is an assertion of attentional agency. By refusing to allow your cognitive and emotional resources to be hijacked, you reinforce your autonomy and reassert a healthy structure of interaction, one in which relevance is contingent upon value, not demand. This not only neutralizes narcissistic control, but establishes a precedent for balanced, intentional communication moving forward.